Thanks for tuning in to Chrontendo episode 19. What do we have this time? Well, oddly enough, a sudden increase in the number of sports titles of all things, including 2 pool games. In addition, there's a few ports of some older Japanese computer games, as well as another nice Konami release. And we'll be taking a very brief look at one of Nintendo's most successful marketing tools in the US. Episode 19's first game comes from the ever-busy Nintendo. Too busy to develop their own games, as a matter of fact. Thus, this is another title from HAL Laboratory, who would eventually become one of Nintendo's major second-party developers. Heck, Satoru Iwata, the president of HAL, eventually became the CEO of Nintendo themselves, so the two companies are intimately connected. So, what sort of exciting game does HAL have in store? How's this for a great idea? It's Mario playing golf. Now wait a second, you say. Haven't we seen this game before? Yes we have, 2 times as a matter of fact. This is Famicom Golf US Course, the sequel to Famicom Golf Japan Course, which came out, not that long ago, back in February 1987. One unusual thing about this game is the pre-game credits, which list Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo's president at the time, as the executive producer, and Masayuki Uemura as producer. Kazunouba Shimizu is mostly known for F-Zero for the Super Nintendo. Despite all the big names in the credits, Famicom Golf is of course just a reworked version of Japan Course, and Japan Course was a reworked version of the old Nintendo Golf. As in all these games, you have the power gauge, which controls the strength and direction of the shot. Hitting on the white line will give you the best shot. You can choose from a variety of clubs, even step back and take a few practice swings. There's the wind to factor in, and once you get on the putting green, you will switch to an overhead shot. All in all, not too terribly exciting, and not even as much fun to play as last episode's Pro Golfer Saru. I guess the most notable thing about this game was the contest done in conjunction with its release. You could take your disc with your saved game down to the video game store and insert it into one of the special FDS fax machines. This would send your score off to Nintendo. Players with the best scores would get one of 10,000 copies of the special game, and that game was none other than Punch-Out! The special Punch-Out! Gold cartridge is a bit different than the version that was actually given a wide retail release later, but we'll have to save that for another time. From the ever-reliable Pony Canyon, we have another FDS classic. Okay, not really. But Dr. Chaos has a pretty cool title screen. I mean, wow, look at that, dripping blood and everything. This looks pretty spooky. So what is this, an early survival horror game? A Maniac Mansion-like adventure game? Dr. Chaos is a pretty intriguing name. Unfortunately, despite the promise displayed in the intro, Dr. Chaos is a bit disappointing. This is a Pony Canyon game, after all. Oh, the Grim Reaper himself even appears. Well, once we go ahead and load up the game, you'll see that, well, there are some rats and bats running around this house, but Dr. Chaos isn't really a horror game, unless you can consider the controls to be horrifyingly bad. Oddly, the game Dr. Chaos most resembles is Konami's Goonies 2, which had only come out around 3 months before this, so Dr. Chaos can't be a deliberate knockoff. Rather, they must have drawn from the same well of inspiration. They're both side-scrolling platformers with point-and-click style adventure elements thrown in. Whenever you enter a room, the view switches first person, and you have to use a little hand to open doors, pick up items, and so on. Mostly, we are looking for weapons, health, and the occasional hidden passage. Oh yes, and one rather hateful thing. You will find these little random monsters coming out of doors in the room. These will push you back into the hall and you'll need to dispose of them before re-entering the room. The rather stiff and unresponsive controls and the fact that these monsters tend to hit you and then stand right on top of you makes this very irritating. Here we're actually looking at the English version of the game as opposed to the Japanese version. There really aren't any key items to be found in the rooms, nor any other actual characters, no one to really talk to, like in Goonies for example. All the key items are actually found at by defeating the bosses. Dr. Chaos was given a US release by FCI, that's a company related to Pony Canyon that often released the Pony Canyon games in the United States. It was released in 1988. The game is often compared to Shadowgate, one of the Mac Venture point-and-click games released for the Macintosh. However, Shadowgate was first released in 1987 as well, so it couldn't have been a direct influence. Presumably Dr. Chaos, well, could have been inspired by the early MacVenture games, such as Uninvited, or more likely by Japanese-style adventure games like Portopia. Anyway, some rooms have a hidden entrance to warp zones. Oh, and speaking of warp zones, this scene might remind you of something found in a perhaps better known game. Oh, here's the first boss. He's absurdly easy. Others can be absurdly hard. There are 11 of these warp zones altogether, all quite similar and with a pretty limited variety of enemies. You sort of get the same enemies over and over again. There are occasionally these tougher enemies that come around, like these flying skeletons, or these weird fat skeletons called elephants for some reason. And I'm trying to deal with some of the flying skeletons now. Not quite sure what's up with the elephant. Maybe he's supposed to resemble the Elephant Man skeleton? Well, unlike Goonies 2, Dr. Chaos is not a huge game. The mansion has 4 floors and about 20 to 25 rooms. Oh, by the way, one annoying thing about the game, I was just throwing some grenades. Grenades actually damage you, as well as the enemies. There's a password system in the US version so you can restart with no weapons if you die. Dr. Chaos is maybe somewhat fondly remembered by some gamers, perhaps because there weren't that many games like it on the NES back then. And while the game seems somewhat ambitious, the execution is bad enough to categorize it as a mediocre game. This should be expected because it was developed by SRS and Marionette, 2 Japanese contract developers. They were the same team behind The Adventures of Shatran, that Milo and Otis game we covered a few episodes ago. The overall design is pretty uninspired. Pretty much every room in the mansion looks identical. Killing enemies can be a bit of a pain. Regular enemies tend to respawn very quickly on screen, sometimes right in front of you or in the exact same spot where you just killed one. Too many large enemies on the screen will cause massive slowdown, as we see here. The combined fact that they will follow you and try to mob you can cause some major headaches. If you run out of ammo before you kill a boss, you are pretty much screwed. Oh yes, and those monsters that push you out into the hallway like we saw a few moments ago can pretty much drain you of your life way too quickly by sort of doing multiple hits over and over again. Here I've had a problem with running out of ammo before I could actually kill the boss, thus making him pretty much undefeatable. Here's another one of those hallway monsters. This one actually slows you down, and pretty much just sort of stands on top of you. Now, should you actually make it to the final boss, which turns out to be a lion throwing fireballs, you'll get to use all the parts you've been collecting to make a laser, the only weapon that can defeat this boss. Dr. Chaos is, incidentally, your scientist brother, who got himself in trouble by opening gateways to another dimension, sort of like Half-Life or something. At the end, you rescue him, and you're reunited in this oddly romantic-looking sequence. Well, Dr. Chaos, nice idea, but sort of bad execution. I guess it's probably still about the best Pony Canyon game so far, not developed by either Compile or Toplin. And if for some reason you actually make it to the end of the game, you'll get one of these old-fashioned, hilariously understated congratulations messages that used to appear when you finished the video game back in the day. This episode has 2 Data East games, both released in 1987. The first up is Ring King, the more notorious of the 2. It was retitled for its Japanese release by Namco as Family Boxing. Namco is releasing a series of family sports games for the Famicom. Prior to this was Family Stadium and Family Jockey. But this is a port of a 1985 arcade game from an obscure little publisher Woodplace called King of Boxer. Data East released the game in the arcades in the US as Ring King, and not surprisingly they called the NES version that as well. Unfortunately for Ring King, it came out a few months before the well-loved Punch-Out! And while Punch-Out! Is pretty much everything you could hope for in a boxing game, Ring King falls way short of what you would want in any video game, period. Aside from the obvious complaints, the ugly characters, or rather just one ugly character with multiple weird palette swaps, and the sort of bad sound effects, hard use controls, the main thing about Ring King is it's just plain boring. The port's actually a little slower than the arcade version. Everything seems pretty sluggish. While Ring King is certainly not a good game, I don't know if it's quite as bad as people think it is. It tends to make a lot of worst of NES lists. You know, it's not exactly a whole lot of fun to play. Now, probably the thing about this game that's been most ridiculed is the between-round cutscenes, where it appears your attendant is performing oral sex on you. This is actually just bad work from Namco, or have reported this thing. In the original arcade version, it's clear that just your cup is being adjusted or something like that. Namco did have the largesse to add a few gameplay options. Tournament, where you face a series of boxers in order to contend for the championship. There's a 2-player version that lets you rope in an unfortunate soul to play it with you. And the watch option features computer-controlled opponents. Considering how unpleasant Ring King is to play, that actually might be your best bet. Here you can see what I mean about sort of weird palette swaps. Why does the guy have green hair? Well, anyway, if you're a huge boxing game fanatic, I guess you can certainly try this out, but don't expect anything near the level of Punch-Out! We have a few games by ultra-obscure publishers this time around, and this is one of them, Michael English Daibouken by Scorpionsoft. A rather deceptively titled game, since there is nothing Dai or Boken-y about this game, because it's an educational game. For those not in the know, this game is based on a licensed property, What's Michael, a very popular manga by Makoto Kobayashi, commonly described as the Japanese Garfield, due to Michael's appearance as an orange cat. The title indicates this is an English learning game, apparently to teach young children the English alphabet and some basic vocabulary. So you select your world and your level, and then you're off to learn some English letters. There's a few different gameplay variations available in this game. So on this one, for example, you simply need to copy the English word by grabbing the right letters. Every game seems to have the same basic mechanic. You control Michael, and the object is to jump around crazily and grab the correct letter as it rises out of the ground, while avoiding the incorrect ones. Presumably Michael is doing all this for the sake of his kittens in an attempt to improve their English skills. Touching that cat head will give you a hint by showing you the word in Japanese. Oddly enough, on the space level, the kittens are all wearing space helmets, while Michael is somehow able to survive naked in the icy vacuum. Does this game achieve its goal of teaching kids English? Well, I don't know, it's hard to say. I guess it seems well done, better than those Sunsoft educational games. One thing, Michael doesn't really look much like his comic book counterpart. But I guess Scorpionsoft seems to have put together a rather decent title. Now, who are these Scorpionsoft guys? No idea. As far as I know, they only released one more game for the Famicom. Please note the presence of the cross on the church in the background there. That probably wouldn't have flown had this game been given US release, which obviously it wouldn't have. So Michael gets a little halo when he dies. You can save your game, or rather you can save your scores, and continue on. I just failed a level, so I have the ominous black paw, which equals death, on the scorecard there. Hooray! It's Woody Poco. Look at all those little dancing Woody Pocos. Who the hell is Woody Poco? I really have no idea. But I can tell you this is a somewhat mysterious exploration-based side-view action game released by DBsoft. It's been a while since we've seen a DBsoft game. The last was Layla, a space-themed side-scrolling action game released in December of 1986. DBsoft mostly released games for Japanese computers. And Woody Poco was one of those games. Originally released in late 1986 on such systems as the PC-88 and the FM-77. This is the PC-88 version here. It has much cooler music than the Famicom version. One mystery surrounding this game is who is actually responsible for making it. As you might have noticed on the title screen of the Famicom version, it shows a copyright to DBsoft and Layla and Danny. Who the heck, or what the heck, is Layla and Danny? Are there any relationship to DBsoft's Layla game, or is it just a coincidence? Now, to confuse matters, other versions, like those released for the PCs, such as the PC-88 and this one right here, which is actually the MSX version, credit Minasan Omedeto Yokotane. Is this some little-known Japanese developer? Is Woody Poco a licensed character? Boy, I really couldn't find the answer to that. Either way, this game is a somewhat typical of the post-Zelda adventure game type thing. You roam around killing monsters, visiting shops to purchase items, collecting money. One unique feature is you possess two hands, and you can hold one item in each hand, just like real life. Your goal is to make your way across the landscape towards a castle where you have to, well, surprise, surprise, rescue a princess. In fact, an item's function may change depending on which hand you hold it in. One thing you do need to buy is a candle in order to light the dark underground passages. You enter these through like the various holes that occasionally appear on the overworld. Ah, there is the candle shop there. As you can see, I'm sort of firing the spheroid shaped thing that you can see in my hand is what you use to fire a weapon. When you buy the candle, you need to hold it in your other hand in order to use it. Now, Woody Poco is a fascinating looking game. There are an unusual number of items to be had. At least more than in most games of this time period. For example, there are shoes for speeding you up, umbrellas that'll slow your descent when you jump, so you can jump over like various lakes and rivers and whatnot. Getting around in Woody Poco seems to be a bit more involved than in most of these games. Okay, so I've entered one of the underground passages here to pick up some extra money. But definitely simply, rescuing the princess isn't really a simple matter of walking left to right. On the other hand, it's certainly not nearly as spread out as Legend of Zelda. There is sort of like a general progression that you're making. But some of these underground passages are actually multiple layers deep. For example, you may be in a cavern, and you'll find another hole that takes you down to a lower cavern. Another interesting little feature is when you select the game, you can actually choose what gender, whether you want to play as a boy or a girl. That demonstrates how the umbrella is used. There seem to have been a few changes made from the original computer versions for the Famicom. It seems like the interface is a little bit easier to use when it comes to switching items, and also the layout has been changed around a bit as well. So this is pretty unknown in the West, and it looks like it really could be deserving of further investigation. All of a sudden, we've got all these sports games coming out. If you think back a bit, for a while, there were hardly any sports titles for the system, other than a handful of releases by Nintendo themselves. Now, the sports genre seems to be coming to life on the Famicom. Well, it's pretty obvious this is a pool game. Exciting Billiard is in fact the first in a little series of sports games Konami released, all with the word exciting in the title. Of course, if the title needs to try to convince you the game is exciting, well then, maybe it really isn't that exciting after all. Still, nice atmospheric intro here. You might think the guy's carrying a baseball bat or something to do some inter-alley ass-kicking, but no, he's just walking into a pool club. If nothing else, exciting Billiard seems to exist in a somewhat concrete environment. The pool club is given sort of a certain amount of convincing detail. Note the Hustlers Club name on the marquee. Konami seems to have a real fascination with the word hustler as pertaining to pool. And look at this bar. Looks like they're well stocked in Tanqueray gin. Well, there is definitely a gambling theme going on in this game, as you're placing bets on your pool abilities. The actual barroom is rather nicely detailed, with a pinball table, drink sitting on the table in the corner, and that sort of thing. Lunar Pool was the first pool game for the Famicom, but Exciting Billiards expands the realism of earlier pool games with the multiple views of the action going on there. So you play the game by using your D-pad to control the direction of your pool cue. As you do this, it gives you a very nice worm's eye view of the balls there that sort of moves around as you move your pool cue around. Use the button to pull the pool cue back and then strike the cue ball. The little power gauge lets you know how hard the ball is going to be hit. Now this game is sort of original for the Famicom, but not quite. Its roots go back to Video Hustler, an early 80s arcade game from Konami. Video Hustler was pretty typical of pool games at the time and had a very simple control scheme. Then, a little later in 1987, Konami released Rack 'em Up to the arcades, which in Japan was called What Else? The Hustler. This is really just an arcade variation of Exciting Billiards, with some almost identical details, like the wood floor or the cutscenes of you making the shot. It's hard to say which was conceived first, the arcade game or the FDS one. Now, as I was saying, there's a heavy gambling element in Exciting Billiards. You're often asked to sort of make little bets at particular points in the game. Another nice feature, pressing the A button will show you the numbers on the balls. And as we've seen, the actual mechanic for shooting the balls is sort of very similar to that found in Nintendo's Golf. Now, I've never really been a huge fan of pool games. It's not like there's any shortage of places to play pool in the real world. But for people who really love pool, I guess they might get a kick out of this game. I suppose the physics seems pretty decent. Still, I like Lunar Pool from Compile and Pony Canyon quite a lot better, but I guess I can't really fault this game for being what it is. Just like I mentioned with Dynamite Bowl last episode, the basic mechanics of this sort of game haven't really changed much in the last 20 years. Though of course nowadays this sort of thing wouldn't be really a full retail release. It would more like be a mini game or something included inside another game. Hey, it's another baseball game. Third one for the system. And from Jalico, it's Morero Pro Yaku, which starts with a pretty cool intro. The player hits a rather ridiculous home run. It's one distraught pitcher, but what an arrogant bastard. Look at him running around constantly pumping his fist as he jogs around the island. Okay, as you may have figured out, this is the same game known in the US as Bases Loaded, but god, what an ugly title screen. That logo looks so much worse than the one on the Japanese version. As far as I can tell, not much has changed. You begin by selecting the team and your starting pitcher. The city names are provided, but unlike the earlier RBI baseball, there's no baseball license provided here, so the players are all completely fictional. In the Japanese version, I think at least some of the players were based on real individuals. Stats are conveniently provided for all the pitchers. Naturally, there's two gameplay options. You can play against the computer, or you can play against another person in the versus mode. Well, right off the bat, we notice that Morero tries to depict the game in a much more detailed and realistic fashion than earlier baseball games like Nintendo's Baseball or RBI Baseball, where all the characters are sort of chubby and cartoonish looking. As the pitcher, you use the D-pad to control the direction of the pitch, The degree of control over the ball is surprisingly pretty high, a bit more so than in the two earlier games. Fielding controls are pretty standard. You catch the ball and then use the D-pad to select which base you want to throw it to. But check out that crazy floating catcher's mitt. He never moves, but the mitt just floats around. So here's the question, is Mamorumo port of an arcade game? Well, I'm not sure. There was this arcade version released by Jalico, which looks very similar to the Famicom version. The copyright says 1988, but some Japanese sources say it was released in 87. Maybe late 1987? I assume both versions were developed in tandem. Odd thing, there was a very sort of similar situation with that Konami pool game. Now, going back to the home version, I should point out that this was developed by none other than Toza, the infamous and secretive contract developer responsible for so many bad Famicom games. This seems of higher quality than their usual stuff. Listen to all the impressive voice samples, for example. Pretty unusual at the time. This was prominently mentioned on the cover of the US version. Regardless, there is some weirdness in this game. One thing that I don't like is that while the behind the pitcher view is pretty cool for pitching, it's really not so good for batting. It takes a while to distinguish between good and bad pitches, and swinging the bat correctly does take some practice. Just like pitching, you use the D-pad to control how you swing, sort of up, down, etc. Still, it seems a little awkward, and the pitches look really weird. Often it seems like the pitcher is aiming at my shins. I'm not really sure exactly why they keep throwing the ball so low. Now in the US, this game is fondly remembered by some. I guess the voice samples, realistic graphics, and good controls made a pretty good impression back in 1988, despite some of the flaws. In Japan, Mamorumo seems to be thought of rather poorly. Teams are often unbalanced, and the CPU can be very stupid. There's also a bug that will prevent the CPU from swinging at low pitches made by left-handed pitchers. There are some cool details, most famously, beating certain batters with the ball will cause them to run up to the mound to fight you. Unfortunately, it didn't happen while I was recording this video. I'd say Mamorumo or Bases Loaded is a fun game to sort of pick up and play. Oh, I just scored a home run here. Pitcher is always so upset. Occasionally it happens. You should really get over it. I don't think this will really probably satisfy your average hardcore baseball game fan. It doesn't seem to have the same devoted following as the RBI games. Before we move on to our next title, let's take a moment to look at one of Nintendo's most successful tools for marketing the NES in the United States, namely Nintendo Power Magazine. As I've mentioned before, 1987 was really the year the NES took off in the US, with Nintendo bringing out huge releases like Zelda, Metroid, and Punch-Out!, and a bunch of third-party developers coming on board. By returning a filled-out form to Nintendo, you could be enrolled in the Nintendo Fun Club. Nintendo Power actually began life as a simple newsletter sent out to Fun Club members. In early 1987, the first issue of the quarterly Nintendo Fun Club News was mailed out. The rather humble black, white, and red 8-page publication promoted Super Mario Bros. On the cover, mentioned upcoming releases, and contained a few articles regarding events surrounding Nintendo. Nintendo of America's Howard Phillips was introduced as the public face of Nintendo in the US, though he's missing his trademark bow and tie at this point. Also notable was the very brief prose corner column found in the letters section. Eventually, tips, strategies, and guides would become the raison d'etre for Nintendo Power, with virtual walkthroughs for popular titles taking up a huge chunk of each issue. Issue number 2, Spring '87, featured Zelda on the cover, and again with issue 3, which switched formats to full color and longer issues. Issue 3 contained ads from other publishers, with write-ups announcing new release titles like Kid Icarus. A big strategy guide for Zelda dominated this issue, including the endlessly reprinted world map in a 2-page spread. By 1988, the newsletter was running bi-monthly, each issue running about 30 pages. Major new releases like Punch-Out! Were given detailed coverage. Also found were lots of upcoming titles and previews, such as this one for Dragon Warrior, around 2 years before it was released in the US. Full-page ads from pretty much every company that released games for the system dotted the magazine, including this one for Tengen in its pre-unlicensed days. Issue 6 featured a covered story on the supposedly forthcoming Zelda 2, which ended up being delayed several times, so readers could get tips on playing a game that wouldn't be released in the US for another 8 months or so. Issue 7 was the final one for the Nintendo Fun Club news. The first issue of the slicker Nintendo Power hit the shelves next month, featuring a very cool Super Mario Bros. 2 cover. The new 100-page magazine once again focused heavily on write-ups of new releases, as well as detailed guides with tons of screenshots laid out in a comic book-like fashion. Not just Nintendo's, but also other publishers' releases were profiled. Virtually every forthcoming game got some kind of promotion in Nintendo Power's pages. Also found were reader submissions, the Howard and Nestor comic strip, featuring a cartoon version of Howard Phillips, game sales charts, and so on. Non-Nintendo publishers even got cover stories. And of course, when Zelda 2 was actually released, it did receive heavy coverage. Nintendo Power was incredibly successful in building loyalty to the Nintendo brand, and of course is still published to this day, though not by Nintendo themselves. In the days before the World Wide Web or Brady guidebooks, Nintendo Power and related publications was the source for guides, maps, and secrets for NES games, and was invaluable in helping establish Nintendo's dominance in the US market in the pre-PlayStation era. Jesus, another pool game? As I've mentioned before, it's odd how different companies somehow release similar titles at the same time. In this case, both Konami and Data East released pool games in the same month. But with Exciting Billiard, it was a Japan-only release, and Side Pocket was another of Data East's games intended for the US market, like Karate Champ. They both hit the shelves sometime in June. The exact date for Side Pocket has not really been recorded, but it did see a Japanese release by Namco in October. A second ago we saw the training mode that the game was kind enough to give you. Shows you exactly how to use the different effects achieved by hitting the ball off center. Side Pocket is sort of a tournament mode. You need to progress through various championships, city, state, USA, and world. The controls are quite similar to Exciting Billiards, with the power gauge controlled by 2 button presses, and even the image of the character taking a shot found in the corner there. There's no betting mechanic, but you do rack up points for sinking balls, and from various bonuses, such as like hitting the ball into a certain corner. Usually these are kind of tough, but occasionally you will get lucky. Like this one right here, for example, it's a pretty easy shot. Now all the points that you've obtained are added up with additional points based on things like the consecutive number of balls sunk, and sinking them in numerical order, that sort of thing. All this adds up to your total. Get enough points and you move on to the next level. And there actually is one last chance for some additional points. It's a bonus round. Sometimes these things are very easy, and sometimes they're virtually impossible, like this one where there's light bulbs all over the table. Once you become the champion, the girl there will fall in love with you. Unlike the Konami game, Side Pocket has sort of a classy, old-fashioned vibe to it, as if you were some sort of well-dressed gentleman pool player from the 1920s. Now the physics are a little weird. Look how slow the balls move when you break, even at max power. While I'm not a huge fan of pool games, Side Pocket is pretty good for this sort of thing. Decent controls, an interesting scoring system, a bit of variety with the bonus rounds, or the super powerful balls that occasionally appear to sort of like knock everything around real fast. Compared to the really horrible port of Karate Champ, this is a nice little game. Data East is definitely a slippery little company. There really isn't sort of consistency with their releases. Just look at all the bizarre games they've released in the last few episodes, and they don't really seem to have established like a house style or anything like that. But of all the third-party Nintendo publishers, they've been the quickest to focus on the US market. Other than Nintendo themselves, they were for the first to release games in the US only. Once again, Sony dips its toe into the world of console gaming under the aegis of Epic Sony Records. Once again, they've teamed up with the crappy developer ISCO to release a game based on a musical artist. Previously, we've seen Sakima 2 from ESCO, a pretty bad game, and this one really isn't any better. There's an odd water theme going on. You're armed with a squirt gun with a limited supply of water. As the water is depleted, your range decreases. With this game, we've now seen video games based on all three of the holy trinity of Japanese comedians entertainers: Beat Kitano, Sanma Akashiya, and now Tokoro Joji, also known as Tokoro George. An immensely popular media figure, Tokoro George has starred in movies, television shows, released countless albums, and so on. Among his many credits is the Japanese voice of Homer Simpson. Hey, this boss looks like a Big Daddy from BioShock, or maybe the creature from Robot Monster. There is a bit of non-linearity in this game. After you beat the boss, you get to choose which several doors you want to enter in. This is kind of like a Zombie Hunter, a game we'll be seeing later this episode. Altogether, this is sort of an interesting idea, but the game is completely irritating. One major problem: how do you replenish your health and ammo? Well, despite having absurdly little starting ammo, the refills are all hidden. You've got to shoot to find it. Now, since your ammo is limited, you can't just go around shooting everywhere randomly. So, how the hell are you supposed to find health and ammo refills except by sheer dumb luck? Even defeating a boss doesn't replenish anything. You start the next level with your health and ammo depleted. This is really sort of like a textbook example of bad game design. One other notable thing: each level has this weird timer, illustrated by a cloud approaching the sun. You can see it up at the top of the screen there. When the cloud finally covers the sun, this major storm system blows in, and the game gets even harder to play. Seriously, this storm is so bad it somehow even rains inside buildings. While I suppose the Kitano and Sama games have their merits, this one should be avoided at all costs. A nice, haunting musical theme there. Dragon Quest fans, you probably noticed the copyright to Armor Project on the title screen. Yep, this game is designed by Yuji Horii. In fact, it's the follow-up to Portopia, which we covered way back in Chrontendo episode 6. As the title indicates, this game takes place in Hokkaidou, but it opens with a little prologue in Tokyo, which features what else? A crime investigation scene. Hokkaidou Rensa Satsujin is a port of a title that was originally released in 1984 on various Japanese computers. Here's the PC-88 version. Unfortunately, this lacks the really cool music of the NES version, which is too bad since the PC-88 had pretty good sound capabilities. All the illustrations were done in a more realistic style on these computer versions. The Famicom graphics were completely redrawn. Note the controls. Use the number pad to make your selection. On the Famicom game, you use the now standard control scheme in navigating the menu with the D-pad. Other than the NEC computers, it was released for the FM7, the MSX, and more recently has been ported to cell phones and that sort of thing, so it seems to be quite popular. The basic gameplay is the same as Portopia. You have your standard options of looking, talking, moving somewhere else, showing objects, people, among other things. Like in Portopia, you can collect phone numbers and even make phone calls. I guess to the casual viewer, this seems pretty much identical to Portopia, but I think there actually were sort of like a few kind of changes made to the basic scenario. One thing, I don't think there's a first-person maze in this game like Portopia had. It was a little annoying and maybe not the best idea in an adventure game. And there are a few areas to explore at the beginning of the game. Seems like you mostly sort of go around talking to folks and show them the picture of the victim and try to get some information. There is a little bit of sex appeal found in this game. Various sort of attractive female characters appear. This lady right here, for example, holding a little tiny martini glass. At least I think that's what that is. And you'll root all these folks for information. Look at this idiot. Let's discuss the credits on this game briefly. The game was published by ASCII under the name Loginsoft. If you don't recall much about ASCII from earlier episodes, well, they weren't just a video game developer. One of the things they did was publish a computing magazine called Login. Loginsoft, the name that you see on the credits, was the affiliated publisher. I don't know why this wasn't published by Enix, as Portopia was. Now here's something rather cool. After finishing the Tokyo prologue, you get the real intro to the game. Hori's name is prominently mentioned. Very nice little title screen. This rather cinematic delayed opening credits thing would have been very attention-grabbing at the time. And for those who don't know, Hokkaidou is the northernmost island in Japan. Winters get very cold there, hence the bleak snow-filled landscape depicted would be indicative of Hokkaidou to Japanese gamers. This port was done by Pax Softnica, who is primarily a second-party developer for Nintendo. They did Nintendo's Volleyball, for example. The excellent music was produced by Toshiyuki Ueno, who also did some music for Earthbound, which was another Pax Softnica developed title. By the way, Hori created a third game to form sort of an unofficial trilogy of computer adventure mystery games. This last one is called Karizawa Kidnapping Guidance in English, a rather clunky title. For some reason it never received the Famicom port. It's been a while since we've seen a game from Taito. Their last game was a port of Arkanoid from December 1986. Of all the big arcade game companies, Taito has had the least impressive resume when it comes to Famicom games, and Mirai Shinwa Jarvas is certainly not going to improve their standing. Yes, Taito finally has decided to jump on the old Zelda RPG train. Jarvas hit the shelves a mere 11 months after Namco released their crappy action RPG, that Valkyrie game. Undoubtedly, some executive at Taito saw the sales numbers for Zelda and Dragon Quest and decided it was time they finally got in on the action. By the way, this is a fan-translated version of the game, as this was certainly never released outside of Japan. Now, there is some sort of plot behind the game. Your spaceship has crashed on this strange planet, but don't expect any sort of opening cutscenes or explanatory text. And the game pretty much just deposits you on the overworld without any reference to what's going on. One thing that's a little odd is that even though you are clearly some sort of spaceman dude, you're armed with a dagger of some sort. I mean, really, shouldn't you have some kind of ray gun? The world is populated by little Viking dudes wandering around. Well, if you walk around long enough, you'll eventually find the first town. Though, don't expect the townspeople to say anything interesting whatsoever. Once you're here, you can, buy weapons, armor, etc., just the usual stuff. Not to mention healing potions. But there don't really seem to be a whole lot of items in Jarvas. Notice the sort of Zelda-esque perspective inside the shops. Actually, one ugly town. Oh yeah, something else you can do is you can encounter a guy who sends you on a fetch quest. Believe it or not, to find him a pot. Taking a page from Western RPGs, you can join a guild, whereupon you'll switch out your Buzz Lightyear getup for some sort of a super dorky pseudo-medieval outfit. I guess I'll become a fencer. Yeah, now you're a Viking dude. Now granted, I did not play Mirai Shinwa Jarvas for very long, but I did get the impression that it is a pretty terrible game. I've now boarded a ship for the second island, where I'm looking for that pot. For some reason there's a pot just lying around on the ground. It's absolutely amazing how hateful the combat is in these early action RPGs. Valkyrie, Hide and this game all suffer from really bad combat. Some people dislike the combat in Ys, but seriously, play Jarvas and then play Ys, and you will never say anything bad about Ys again. Oh, here I've joined the Mage Guild. Though for some reason I don't seem to have any magic spells. I'm not sure how you get them, but so far mages seem pretty much identical to Vikings. Other oddities, well, buying better weapons don't seem to raise your attack stats. It was actually 10 after I bought the more expensive iron spear, same as it was when I just had the little dagger thing. I didn't find any sort of inn in the town, and healing items seem way too expensive. Oh, I've finally leveled up here. Another kind of odd concept it takes from some Western RPGs, like the Ultima games for example, is that you don't sort of level up on the field. Once you've gotten enough experience points, you actually have to go and talk to the guy who runs the guild in order to level up. Also, there are these really weird duels you can fight, which I always manage to lose in about 1 second, and I'm really not sure why. See, I'm not really sure what happened there. I believe these duels are fought to raise your fame, which will allow you to recruit natives who wander around on the overworld. There's some interesting concepts, but actually playing the game is not fun. And of course, the second I tried to enter the next area, I was killed instantly. So, Taito has tried to make an action RPG and failed miserably. Still, giving this game a try will show you how difficult it was for developers inexperienced in the genre to make a halfway playable RPG. Let's start off June 1987 with a very minor FDS game, Jikai Shounen Mettomag, a game which, much like Woody Poco, lets you choose your gender. This is the Famicom debut from Thinking Rabbit, courtesy of DOG, Square's special FDS label. DOG is becoming quite prolific, this being the 5th game in 1987. The title means something like Magnetic Field Boy, though I have no idea what Mettomag is supposed to mean. It's a cute little puzzle platformer game, but it does seem to be aimed at younger gamers. Or so I gather based on the simplicity of these early levels. As you may have gathered from watching this video, your character is always in a state of either red or blue polarity. While he's blue, the blue objects have an effect on him, while the red ones are ignored, and vice versa. There are blue and red spheres, which will change his polarity to that color, as well as the yellow ones, which will simply reverse his color regardless of what he currently is. Teleportation there is actually pretty cool and actually a little horrifying looking. Most common are the little arrows that will give you a little bit extra push in the direction of the arrow. The downward pointing arrows will make it difficult for you to jump up as they push you down. The object is to collect every spear in the level and then find the exit. Now, this is definitely an original idea, and of course Thinking Rabbit was known for its puzzle games. Their 1982 puzzle game, Sokoban, was extremely influential and popular. We've seen a good number of sort of Sokoban-inspired games released for the Famicom so far. Now, despite the fact that these sorts of games are very popular in Japan, consider how insanely successful Lode Runner was, for example. I can only assume this was not a huge smash, at least based on the story of how the DOG label flopped and drove Square to the verge of bankruptcy. Unfortunately for Thinking Rabbit, they never really seemed to repeat the success of Sokoban. This game is vaguely amusing, at least for a little bit, but doesn't really seem to be too special. Wow, so how many Famicom games have not one, but 2 speech samples? We've actually hardly seen any games that try to employ speech, so I guess that was the big thrill this episode. And this is Zombie Hunter. We are treated to a very nice fan-translated version, so you can enjoy this lengthy title scroll should you choose to play the game. Now there's one thing that kind of pisses me off about Zombie Hunter. First of all, I've played quite a bit of this, and I have yet to see an actual zombie. Not one goddamn zombie in this entire game, nor do you really do any hunting. Instead, this is sort of a typical fantasy-styled game where you swing your sword and throw fireballs, and you have sort of various monsters with names like Gorgos and Barus, but the name Zombie Hunter seems completely inappropriate. Something else to be aware of, there's a manga called Zombie Hunter, which involves actual zombies, but has no relation to this game. And something else is that this game is developed by Linar, the same good folks who brought you Bird Week and Deadly Towers, which was that much derided action-adventure game we covered in episode 13. Now, Zombie Hunter was published by a pretty unknown company called High Score Media Works. They would only release one other Famicom game. Now, Deadly Towers was almost impossibly hard and frustrating, and Zombie Hunter tones down that experience quite a bit. Instead of huge, imposing mazes, Zombie Hunter has sort of flat, side-scrolling levels with only the slightest hint of non-linearity. The entire game seems to consist of walking forward and killing monsters. Monsters appear at certain set points in a level. Killing them will get you experience. But also, a chest will be dropped. Usually it just contains gold, but sometimes an item. This could be food, medicine, armor, weapons, etc. You will sometimes be given the choice of which path you take, but it doesn't really matter because all the levels are sort of the same. This game is not exactly Castlevania 3. So anyway, the thing about the game is that you don't really know what items certain monsters are going to drop, so you can actually miss out on valuable items or weapons. Really, I guess, in order to play the game, you sort of have to kind of wander back and forth a lot, fighting the same monsters over and over again. Eventually hoping to get a important weapon upgrade or armor upgrade. At the end of each level you'll battle a boss, but there's really nothing too interesting about these. It's just sort of run up and hit him until he dies. Now I guess the main problem with Zombie Hunter is actually it's pretty boring and repetitive, and has some of the most nondescript level design imaginable. The backgrounds are really plain looking, and the enemies are all just sort of generic fantasy monsters. I guess a huge chunk of the memory was taken up by those voice samples in the beginning. Zombie Hunter isn't on a very big cart, only 1.25 megs, while a lot of big adventure games were on 2 meg carts. Oddly, Activision considered releasing this in the US, but the title ended up being cancelled. Activision may currently be the biggest US video game publisher, but back in the late 80s they were going through a bit of a rough period. So with its rather simplistic gameplay and sort of boring levels, Zombie Hunter isn't very good. However, the next game we're going to see is actually a similar idea, but much better executed. This opening explanatory text scroll sets up the story. You're out to avenge your dead brothers and kill this dragon that's causing all sorts of trouble. By the way, this game was released in Japan only, but is now more playable due to a very high quality English translation patch. Getsufuu Maden sort of resembles Zelda 2, with the action alternating between top-down overworld sequences and then side-scrolling action sequences. Takes place on 4 interconnected islands. You move around each island by traveling down various paths, and your route is frequently interrupted by these very short dungeons. The dungeons are all completely linear, and all you have to do is simply move from one end to the other, just like the warp zones in Dr. Chaos. Whereas with Dr. Chaos, you're throwing your controller at the screen about every 30 seconds, Getsufuu Maden is a blast, thanks to the silky smooth controls, good hit detection, and all the other hallmarks of Konami quality that make the difference between a good game and an unplayable mess. Your main weapon is your sword, but you are able to buy other weapons. Enemies will usually drop either cash, or their soul will float up, and you can collect that to get some hit points. Those little sort of white glowing things look kind of like bombs. You saw a sort of very similar idea in the Ninja-kun games. One other thing that makes this game really cool is the great graphics and the very interesting looking levels. Konami was known for good looking games around this time, but Getsufuu Maden certainly lives up to the reputation that was founded on games like Castlevania. And just look how cool this level is. There's also a very wide variety of enemies. You are constantly encountering new ones, and virtually every dungeon is unique looking, even though they all have sort of a very similar layout. And of course, what would any good adventure game in 1987 be without some sort of RPG elements thrown in? You use the gold you collect to buy items in the shops, such as health refills, new weapons, among other things. One thing you must buy is a sword that can cut through walls. This special sword is actually necessary in order to get through the game. Additionally, as you use your sword, the little sword bar in the upper left-hand corner slowly increases. As the bar fills up, your attack gets stronger. Again, this is a pretty satisfying mechanic. The more you use it, the stronger you get. Oh, here I'm going to use the special sword I bought to break through those walls. And get this very handy projectile weapon, which comes in useful against the first boss. So as you can see, now that I've got this new weapon, suddenly these enemies, which were kind of difficult, actually become a lot easier to just go ahead and chew through. But of course, as you progress, the enemies get stronger, so your sort of strength is only temporary. It is one of the nice things about this game. It's sort of like the constantly changing sort of difficulty. You know, you get stronger and then the enemies get stronger. Now, to get to a new island, you actually have to face these sort of creepy skull-faced bosses. If you defeat them, they'll give you a pass. These guys tend to be pretty simple, and, though much like Castlevania, or later Mega Man I guess, having the right weapon can make a big difference when fighting these bosses. In this case right here, having that projectile weapon makes things go a lot more smoothly. Now, if there is one major flaw in this game, it's this: these 3D maze sequences. There are 3 large first-person dungeons, quite similar to Wizardry, or those actually found in Konami's own Ganbare Goemon. These sequences are long, there's no map, and it's pretty hard to find your way around these mazes. This is actually probably the most irritating thing in the entire game. Once you actually get to the end of the labyrinth, you'll face one of the major bosses. This right here seems like a sort of a little homage to Gradius of all things. And seriously, look at this guy. Look at a giant Cyclops samurai skull guy. Once you defeat him, you'll obtain one of the swords that you're looking for in the game. Now, one thing about this video, there's sort of like a technical issue here. This is actually some of the fights in the labyrinth. The game employs some sort of weird transparency effect that prevented the video from really capturing these fights correctly. Not really sure how that was even done on the Famicom. But at any rate, these fights are quite annoying, and the enemies are really hard to hit. You move around the mazes very slowly, and the enemies can drain your health quite quickly. For some reason, when you fight the enemies, you often miss. I guess you can't really tell by looking at these videos here, but these fights are really much more annoying than pretty much anything else in the game. While these sequences don't really ruin the game, they are the major flaw in an otherwise great title. The game occasionally sort of messes with you a little bit, like that pseudo-boss a second ago there, who'll give you a pass if you just pester him enough. One of the most striking things in the game are the rather large character portraits you occasionally see when talking to someone, like that demon there just a moment ago. Compare these to the way other games have handled talking NPCs, for example Zelda or the Dragon Ball game. Everything here is so richly detailed. Konami is interrupting the gameplay for a moment with these scenes, but they really bring you deeper into the world the game has created. Okay, now for a little bit of weirdness. While technically an original Famicom game, in Japan the similarity to a 1986 Namco arcade game, Genpei Tomaden, has been noticed. From the character design, to that witch that kind of opens up the game there, to the look of the levels, the similarities are rather surprising. Whether this is a coincidence or not, it's really hard to say, but it is a little bit bizarre. Even sort of like the little Japanese gate that you get at the end of each level is the same. Genpei Tomaden eventually had a Famicom port, but it was oddly changed into a turn-based RPG. And even more strangely, the Famicom port added an overworld that was very similar to that of Getsufuu. What's all this mean? Well, boy, I don't know, I really have no idea. I mentioned some of the cool power-ups you can buy, and this one's quite useful. It's a Metroid-like spin attack. And look at this cool boss. It's actually 3 ninjas that have joined together with some kind of weird robot creature. So anyway, your overall goal is to find the sword necessary to kill the final boss. It's created by combining 3 swords together, and you need to sort of explore several islands and 3 labyrinths, fight a boss at the end of each labyrinth. Once you've done all that, you'll find the 3rd sword, and they'll be joined together for sort of like the super sword used to kill the dragon boss. As I've mentioned before, this game really keeps things fresh. I mean, you don't really sort of see like the same level with the same enemies over and over again. Ah, there's the last sword right there. And, you know, once again, there are those weird transparency effects in these cutscenes that simply, for whatever reason, cannot seem to be captured on this video, so you're not really getting the full effect here. You see like the ghost of his brothers appearing, and their own swords come to merge with his. Getsufuu must hold the record for the most number of skulls and severed heads found in a video game. Really, I mean, they're everywhere in this thing. I can see why this didn't get a US release. Well, while Getsufuu is a flawed game in some regards, it is far and away the game I liked most this episode, and is the sort of game I would hope Konami would make after Castlevania. It is very much a follow-up in the style to the first Castlevania game. And despite those horrible labyrinth scenes, the game really drew me in a way that a lot of the games of this era do not. For example, the fantastic graphics, this must be about the best looking game for the Famicom so far. The music, the easy-to-use controls, the completely badass final boss. I mean, just look at that thing. How many sprites do we have on the screen here at once? Getsufuu really stands head and shoulders above so much of the crap on the system, like Zombie Hunter, for example. I really can't recommend it strongly enough. Oh yeah, and something about virtually every single Konami game, be it Castlevania or Green Beret or whatever, it always ends with the bad guy's base blowing up. It's like a common theme. I wonder how our hero managed to get out of that alive. Konami really seems to be on a roll about this time. Consider that about 1 month after this game, they released Metal Gear for the MSX2. And while Getsufuu Maden is not nearly as historic or groundbreaking as Metal Gear, in its own right, it is a very good game, and definitely an undiscovered gem. Guy looks like he's having some sort of seizure. We close out this episode with Booby Kids, perhaps the most unfortunately named Famicom game we've seen so far. With a title like that, you really have no idea what to expect from the game. Some sort of early H game? Well, no, I guess Booby Kids is just one of those weird random English phrases the Japanese occasionally employ. Unless the developers thought booby and bomb were somehow related. Japanese doesn't have a sound like the at the end of bomb, so I guess it could be. Or maybe they were thinking of booby traps, because the holes you dig to trap enemies in? Well, either way, Booby Kids is sort of a cross between Lode Runner and Bomberman. Just like Lode Runner, your goal is to collect the various objects scattered around the level. Here it's some sort of fruit. All the while you avoid enemies, but you can delay enemies by digging a hole into which they might fall. Once you collect all the objects, the entrance will open up. And there are various sorts of obstructions, walls and whatnot, that prevent you from reaching all the areas. So you will need to utilize warps, springboards, and of course, bombs. At least that's what the game calls them. You actually employ them to look sort of like dynamite sticks. Here I've reached the 2nd level, and I'm going to find some hidden bombs in a moment. That's right, bombs aren't something you can just see on the playing field, you have to just happen to wander in to the square where they're hidden. The explosions, when you set off a bomb, actually greatly resemble those of Bomberman, and they can even be used to kill nearby enemies. However, here's the thing, your supply is limited, so you will need to find the hidden bombs in each level before you can get all the items and escape the level. There is some sort of plot here, I suppose. The game has a time-traveling theme. Here's one of the issues. You don't really know where to set off the bombs. I'm trying to break into that little area, but only one square is actually bombable. And because there's a limited number of bombs, well, You know, that's really not fair when you think about it. So about the plot of the game, you start off in sort of this prehistoric world, but eventually you end up traveling forward in time, with the dinosaurs and the cavemen being replaced by samurais and robots and that sort of thing. There are definitely some irritating moments in this game. Here you need to get across to that little island in the middle and grab all the fruit off there, but how do you get to that one separate isle? The bridge doesn't go all the way across. Well, as it turns out, you have to dig a hole in front of the bridge. That will somehow extend it. And that's not exactly the most logical thing. I mean, you wouldn't really normally think of that. Ah, there we go. Booby Kids is from Nihon Busan, aka Nichibutsu, the same guys who gave us Terra Cresta and Crazy Climber. This is their first foray into console games, and it's not a bad start, but Booby Kids is not exactly original, nor is it really that enjoyable. You might not really think of Nichibutsu as being like an active company still, but they are still around, though they seem to be mostly making things like mahjong games and quiz games and those sort of things intended strictly for a Japanese audience. Okay, so Booby Kids wasn't exactly the best way to end an episode, but I'll make it up to you. Chrontendo episode 20 is going to start out with a game that a lot of you probably remember and love. So check back soon and keep your eyes peeled for a new episode of Chron Sega as well.